thank you again for inviting APWLD in this talk, no? And I can see that there's actually a lot of participants, which is great. And I am asked to present what is development justice and actually the link to the struggle for women's human rights in Asia Pacific. Before I introduce development justice, it's actually crucial, no, to go back to the 2030 agenda and share our analysis and critique and how development justice came to be. Okay, so this is my presentation. Is 2030 Agenda Achievable? So this is just a review if you've already had this in your previous talk. So the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is the blueprint, no, adopted by the UN, the United Nations member states in 2015. And at its heart are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So below are just the history, but I think these are the crucial timeline where how it came to be as the SDGs. So from the Rio Earth Summit and then up to 20 years after the 2012 Rio Plus 20 Summit, which also later is very related to how the development justice movement came to be. So these are the 17 goals. I assume you are familiar, and then of course each of the goals have its own indicators and targets. Okay, and then in order to monitor and review or follow up the 2030 agenda, the high-level political forum, which is the main UN platform on sustainable development and has this central role of review and follow-up of the 2030 agenda, was adopted and actually started implemented in 2016 right after the adoption of the 2030 agenda. So the forum adopts the intergovernmentally negotiated political declaration. So every year, the HLPF happens every July in New York in the UN headquarters, and it's the UN body that adopts intergovernmental negotiated political declaration. So my introduction mentioned the Asia Pacific Regional CSO engagement mechanism, which is actually the CSO platform facilitating participation in the regional level. So before going to the high-level political forum, there are country preparations as well as regional preparation. So that's where APWLD has been facilitating up to the high-level political forum. So, and yeah, that's why the high-level political forum is very important, because it's the one that adopts and come up with the political declaration in relation to the implementation and commitment to the SDG. Okay, so that is the 2030 agenda and the platform where it is actually being monitored. So before I said earlier, before I introduce development justice, it's important to know what are our critiques and analysis of the SDGs, no? So principally, the SDGs, way back in the Rio Earth Summit, it really gave the opening the discourse on sustainable development, and of course the resources are finite, and that the Earth has its limited capacity, etc. But at the same time, it also acknowledges the power relations, no? But I mean, with the SDGs in the UN now, it's not very visible. That's why later on in introducing development justice, that's very important. The power relations and the structures that actually are the barriers in achieving a genuine sustainable development of our societies. So our critique, it starts with the first one. We see that the targets within the agenda fall far short of what is needed to challenge the growth-focused extractivist model of development. So, and that's what I mentioned, it's acknowledging the finite resources of the Earth, but it does not address the power relations, the different structures, and basically the systemic barriers. and it lacks commitment that will shift inequalities of wealth, power, and resources and bind governments to meet their human rights obligations. Then secondly, it lacks accountability. So, looking at how it happens, right, with the high-level political forum, the political declaration. However, the process is voluntary. So every year, there are specific goals under review that is, the HLPF is taking up. At the same time, every year, different countries are volunteering to review their implementation and achievement of the SDGs. So the word voluntary, it's a voluntary process. So it's not a requirement for all governments or all member states to report their progress. And some actually are not in the process. So for example, I think Myanmar haven't had their voluntary national review, or I don't know, they don't really have this commitment. So for example, it's weak, and therefore it's voluntary, therefore it's weak. And third, the governments in the process of negotiations or declarations of their political commitments failed to make a single financial commitment. So in parallel to the HLPF, if some of you are familiar, there is the Financing for Development Forum. So it's the parallel space that actually talks about the financing aspect of the SDGs, because obviously we could not achieve the SDGs without resources. And that resources would come from the commitment of the countries. So it's in the course of it has been how many years now? 8 years that the SDGs are implemented and are being monitored and reviewed. There's really not much very concrete commitment from the government in terms of financing. And actually, it's the other way around. There's a lot of regression in terms of commitment. And actually, it's very obvious how the private sector or corporations are more involved in this side, on the financing side of the achievement of the SDGs, which we think is very dangerous because it actually departs from the government's accountability and responsibility and obligation to deliver the sustainable development to the people. So that is the first set of critique. And then just to share to you the current context, because we just had the high-level political forum last July. And so this is, with 2 years of the pandemic, most of the SDGs are regressing. So most of the UN reports, the Economic and Social Commissions have been saying this, that with the current pace of governments and the available data that we have, the SDGs will likely be achieved in 2065. So it's not 2030 agenda anymore, because the goal of the SDG is to achieve the 17 goals by 2030. But it seems with the current, business as usual, it's more likely 2065 or even beyond. So that has been in the latest report of, this is particularly for the Asia Pacific. And then with the recently concluded HLPF, there is still a lack of political will among member states, as we see it in the political declaration that was the outcome of the negotiation. And it's very obvious how corporate and private sector are really influencing the process. So if you are familiar with, in parallel to these processes, there's our common agenda. So it's a new proposal from the UN Secretary General that aims to accelerate the achievement of the SDGs, also the Paris Commitment, etc. But the civil society, like our networks and allies, are very concerned on the term network multilateralism, because in this phrase, it's actually where the private sector and corporations are entering through this multi-stakeholder process. So for us, it gives more of it's like the government is handing over their responsibility to the corporations in terms of achieving the goals, or it's basically the government's obligation. And in the recently concluded HLPF, there's also a lot of rollbacks and back and forth in the language commitments in the HLPF ministerial declaration. So for example, there's a lot of resistances from many member states on the phrase multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. So this is very important, especially for the feminist movements, because it's basically describing the multiple burdens and intersectional issues that the women have been experiencing during the pandemic. But during the deliberation of the political declaration, many member states are opposing this. It's a language game when you're there. So they're opposing this phrase, which actually shows a lack of commitment. Okay, so that is the 2030 agenda and our critique. And I presented that because I will be introducing development justice. So development justice is an alternative framework to the mainstream development that we know of. So it's a transformative framework that aims to reduce inequalities of wealth, power, and resources. And also it places people, that is at the heart of the achievement of the goals, right? At the heart of development. So it is a paradigm that recognizes the importance of the Earth's planetary boundaries over sustaining profits. And development justice also requires and acknowledges historical responsibility, or the past injustices, to be remedied, and new just, sustainable, and democratic systems to be developed. So it basically acknowledges the power structures, the systemic challenges that we have today in our societies, and also it demands justice. It's not a simple delivery of service, but it demands justice from the previous and past historical obligations. So it could be, for example, climate, right? So climate change, how global north or how industrialized countries have historical responsibility on what's happening right now in the climate crisis, climate impacts to the most vulnerable countries. So I'm saying that it's a movement. It's not just a concept. It's not just a basic call or demand, but it's a movement, because that's why earlier the 2012 timeline is very important, the Rio +20, because it is also when civil society across the region have been gathering to build linkages and collective assessments on how, basically on how can we achieve the SDGs, what's the problem, what's wrong. So it is where this development justice has been developed. And from there, 2013, 2015, and then, basically it's when the Asia-Pacific Regional CSO Engagement Mechanism was formed, and the development justice as a unity was agreed to, and it's the uniting call forward in the engagement in the Agenda 2030 process. Sorry, next. Okay. So before I go to the principles of development justice, I have an 8-minute video. I hope it's not too long, but it's very, it will explain, it will also give examples on how development justice looks like, and how do we actually use development justice as a framework and as an analysis.
We live in a world where a Bangladeshi woman garment worker in her entire lifetime earns less than what the CEO of Inditex earns in just 4 days. And this inequality is escalating. Built on the notion that development and growth go hand in hand, this profit-driven model has channeled wealth, power, and resources from the poor to the rich. Only 26 people own the same amount of wealth as the world's poorest half, most of whom are women. Rich nations claim they are developing poor nations through aid and investment. In 2012, developing countries received $1.3 trillion. but lost 3.3 trillion. Who is developing whom here? Unregulated corporate greed has also worsened the global climate catastrophe. Just 100 corporations are responsible for 71% of global carbon emissions. Meanwhile, the Pacific Islands are drowning, and they have contributed next to nothing. The world is seeing its first climate refugees from Papua New Guinea. The United Nations has warned we have a little over a decade left to save the planet. Our democracy and human rights are under attack from governments, corporate greed, and war. In 2018 alone, 321 human rights defenders were killed across 27 countries, 39 of whom were women. Government spending on the military rose to more than $1,700 billion. This could have paid for the education of 1.9 billion people in South Asia 17 times over. But it does not have to be this way. People everywhere are resisting this unjust model and demanding development justice, a model that places the poor, the marginalized, and the planet at the heart of development. It aims to reduce inequalities between countries, within countries, between peoples, and between men and women using 5 transformative shifts. Redistributive justice means taking wealth, power, and resources from the hands of the few and putting it back into the hands of the many. Just an extra 0.5% tax on the world's richest could educate 262 million children and provide healthcare for 3.3 million people. Cutting 10% of annual investments in the defense sector could end poverty and hunger in 15 years. In Chhattisgarh, India, over 1,700 farmers fought back when Tata Steel Plant grabbed land from 10 villages. The farmers were arrested, but persisted. After 8 years of struggle and demands to the government, Tata finally withdrew and the farmers got their land back. Economic justice means economies work for the people rather than people working for the economy. It means people and workers define and decide what their work is and where it will be used. It means their work will be recognized and valued, and that workers are guaranteed decent work, a living wage, and the freedom to unionize and organize. Strong unions reduce inequalities. In the last 8 decades, unions have boosted wages by 10 to 20%. For years, nurses in India were largely unorganized, lowly paid, and subjected to exploitation. 6 of them came together and formed the United Nurses Association. Initially based in Kerala, UNA spread across the country, using its power to bring about wage increases and better working conditions. Its efforts improved the public healthcare standard and led to a decrease in the nurses-to-patient ratio in many hospitals. We can wipe out discrimination, marginalization, and exclusion of, and violence against people of any class, race, ethnicity, caste, gender, sexual orientation, or other identity. Social and gender justice includes dismantling an oppressive system of patriarchy that's being reinforced by globalization, fundamentalisms, and militarism. We can repeal discriminatory laws and implement better ones that ensure women's rights, voices, agency, autonomy, and bodily integrity. Every year, 1 in 5 Kyrgyzstani women and girls are kidnapped and forcibly married off. After fierce campaigning by the women's movement, the Kyrgyzstani parliament increased the sentence for this crime from 1 year to 8 years. Worldwide, a handful of rich countries and individuals contribute the most to the climate crisis. Environmental justice means those historically responsible should pay. It also means moving from a fossil fuel-based economy towards a feminist, fossil fuel-free future. Energy and resource democracy is possible. We can transform the economy in a just and equitable way. We can shift jobs from polluting industries to jobs in sustainable, clean, renewable energy industries led by communities and led by women. Within these sustainable economies, we can stop the exploitation of women and their unpaid care work. But this can only be done by recognizing and investing in the care economy. Through the 1980s, toxic byproduct from the Panguna copper mine in Bougainville, Papua New Guinea, devastated surrounding farmland and livelihoods. This triggered a decade-long armed conflict that led to the shutting of the mine. Thousands of Bougainvilleans lost their lives. The mine has since remained shut through the efforts of the women of Bougainville, who as late as 2017 blocked a legal maneuver which could have reopened it. The community has proved alternatives to large-scale mining do exist. Many Bougainvilleans are already participating in developing these alternatives. We want a system of governance where any person, regardless of how remote, poor, and marginalized they may be, can hold the highest person in the government to account. People should have the right to make informed policy decisions and to ensure those in power are answerable and accountable to the people. Good governance means establishing policies and practices that restore the power of communities and peoples to determine how resources and state budget get used. It also means regulating multinational corporations and making trade and other economic policies transparent. In Jakarta, people and communities are taking back their power. After decades of receiving poor quality water at one of the highest water tariffs in Southeast Asia, a citizens' coalition has been fighting water privatization through a class action lawsuit. While the effort to remunicipalize water continues, the country's Supreme Court has recognized that water privatization has violated the people's human rights to water. People and communities around the world have shown that a new, fairer approach to development is possible. Can our governments show courage and political will by listening to the people and taking action to change the current unjust, unequal system? It is time for us to unite and exercise our collective people's power to reclaim our rights and our sovereignty. Join us and demand development justice.
The video. So yes, it's development justice is a movement. It's basically resistance and how at the grassroots and community level, the different struggles are really alive and are really, people are really fighting back on the different barriers and challenges, and also challenging the power relations and structures. So just to go back, the video clearly explained the 5 transformative shifts, but also just to go back on the analysis of development justice, how we actually see the intersectionality of issues and things. So in the video, there's actually a lot of cases on land, resource grabbing, also militarization, corporatization, privatization. And this is precisely what we call the systemic barriers. So these are macroeconomic, political barriers that are actually hindering us from achieving real development. So, and of course, there is a bigger power relations behind this. So it's between corporations or governments, and so all those that in power. So just to show to you the 5, how we see the 5, these big macro issues connected to each other. So land and resource grabbing is one. And so we can see a lot of, for example, resource or land grabbing by corporations for extractive industry, for big plantations. And these are actually displacing millions, thousands of peasants, indigenous people, fisher folk. And some of these cases are actually in the name of development, quote unquote development. So for example, when a certain corporation would like to develop an area for mining, so, and of course, indigenous people are located there. So that's where this land and resource grabbing is usually happening. So in the name of development. And then another is corporate capture. So I have mentioned this, how the UN is influenced by the private sector, by corporations. But at the same time, how corporations are running the world. So if you can see the top 20 richest men and how they actually get their riches, their wealth, it's really through profit, not through business, how they are able to expand and exploit more resources from other countries, other people, etc. And then militarism and conflict. So in most cases, we are saying this is intersectional because in a land disputed area, for example, there are the military, so through the government, they are actually working together, military, government, and the corporations to conduct these activities, no, in the name again of so-called development. So again, the question is development for whom? Is it for the people? Is the people benefiting from the mining, for example, or from a big plantation? It could provide jobs, but it's not decent work. It also it does not the resources are not allocated equally. So clearly, in those cases, there is someone, which could be the capitalist or the government, controlling the resources. So that kind of intersectional relationship, no, between these issues and between societal relations. Okay, so another is of course patriarchy and fundamentalism. So we say that in all of these issues and challenges, the women are the most vulnerable. So in most cases, we've seen that in the number of human rights defenders killed, there are women and they are defenders. But how about the ordinary women who are facing everyday access to water, access to food? They are thinking of how they will be managing their households, so unpaid care work. So those kinds of, and then of course, violence against women, domestic violence, abuse, etc. So there are these multiple layers, multiple burden, as we call it, that women are experiencing compared to men. And then fundamentalism, as explained, is how traditions or culture norms are, repressing further women, control over their body, their resources, etc. And then another macroeconomic concept, and then what's happening also are the trade and investment agreements, so WTO. What else? It could also be the different agreements between bilateral trade agreements between countries. So these are actually mechanisms of these global powers, these developed countries, these corporations to retain their system where they could actually exploit more from the communities, from the global south, or from the people. So these five systemic barriers are how in development justice we see the problems, right? On why we don't really have development, why we don't really have genuine development. So that's how we analyze it. And then these five transformative shifts was clearly explained. So the distributive justice, economic justice, social and gender justice, environmental justice, and accountability to the peoples. Okay. So in the video, there's a lot of stories also shared, stories of resistances. But just to share more, I'm sorry for the text, it's long. But just to summarize this, so APWLD is working with different feminist organizations in different countries in the region. And we are more, working at the grassroots, supporting different struggles. So for example, in southern Thailand, this is a very good and landmark case because they are one of our partners, and their struggle there is to oppose the building of a coal-fired power plant that will displace the community, and at the same time, of course, in relation to climate change, how coal-fired power plants are dirty energy source, and also it could contribute more to climate change, for example. So the struggle of the community there, it was actually a successful story. So through advocacy, lobbying, campaigns, different activities, different resistances, they were able to stop the building of this coal-fired power plant. And then another is in Kyrgyzstan. So we are also working with a rural women's organization in Kyrgyzstan, where we can actually see how the struggles continue to the multiple burdens of women during COVID-19, unpaid care work, etc. And then another one, this is also a good case, how SDGs is being maximized as a tool to demand government accountability. So in Mongolia, they also do this. Our partner also did this advocacy lobby engagement, talk to their government, and using the SDG space to bring the issues of the people. So I think they are working with herders, so pastoralists, rural, also farmers, and yeah, basically maximizing the space to demand their government. In the Philippines, this is a classic example also for the demand for economic justice. How our partner there continues to campaign against different economic policies that disadvantageous to women. So, for example, the regressive taxation, where increase in value-added tax will add more or will make goods more expensive, and it will impact more women because women are the ones managing the household or budgeting, for example. So these are very micro cases and stories of resistances that we see as development justice in action. And then I've introduced the Asia Pacific Regional CSO Engagement Mechanism earlier. So it's our convergence at the regional and also at the global level. It's the civil society platform that actually aimed to enable this cross-constituency coordination between women, between farmers, urban poor, etc. In ensuring that all subregions, all countries are able to participate in the process of the Agenda 2030, of course, demanding development justice. So it's not just a simple platform, but it's also a movement where we facilitate people-to-people solidarity. So as I mentioned, how women are in solidarity with farmers' issues. We also have solidarity campaign with environmental defense before, and so on. So yes, so that's it's not 1 hour. That is basically development justice. It's just a snapshot, and then the movement behind it, and how we see or how we actually actualize development justice at the local and community level. So thank you for the opportunity.
I was wondering how you guys would differentiate development justice as a concept to SDG. Do you think it's something that complements SDG because of all the shortcomings you mentioned?
As I mentioned earlier, the SDGs, it's a good start to acknowledge that resources are finite. So how the discourse started in the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. But as we see it, it's not really addressing the issue of inequality. It's if you can see the indicators, the targets, it's a number of for example, number of women and girls have access to water, for example. So it's and most of the time, what's happening in the HLPF, in the reports of the government, it's usually padded that their data. It's not what's happening in the ground, and it's sometimes it's just like a beauty pageant. How governments are trying to make their SDG implementation beautiful, but the people in the ground are not experiencing what they have been reporting. So it's really a question and a paradigm shift of development for whom. And development justice answers that it's not real development if the people are still impoverished, or if there is still a great inequality in this country, for example. So I think that's the main difference between the mainstream development paradigm which the SDGs is implementing, and this alternative paradigm that civil society and most of the movements are advocating for. Yeah.
How do you view the the kind of a gap or the dilemma between the different nation states in politicization, the kind of development goals.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question. Well, development is political itself, right? So, I mean, we can see that on how these sustainable development goals are being negotiated or are being reviewed. It's really a matter of relations between these political stakeholders. So we can see, for example, in the high-level political forum, there's even the language, as I mentioned earlier, that there's a lot of rollbacks and a lot of back and forth on the language because of the lack of political will, the lack of political commitment. So I think, well, I don't know, I cannot say for the Chinese government, but development itself is very political, and we can see how these political relations are impacting development on what discourse will be, what discourse of development will be relevant or will be dominant, for example. So development justice is exactly, it exposed that, that kind of structures, that kind of political in itself, by saying that it's not political, it's also political. Because development, achievement of economic justice, for example, or achievement of maybe goal on poverty, is about politics. It's really about how political economy or the relationship between these sectors are being achieved in order to really serve for the people. So at least in using development justice as a framework, that's how we see it in terms of how do we really deliver development for the people. So yeah.
Thank you, April. And I also think we got a question that I would like you to elaborate on some of the examples of grassroots movements, achieving development justice. I think perhaps the Mongolia example is quite interesting because they really mobilize a lot of people and really utilize the concept of SDG. Could you perhaps elaborate more on that?
Well, yeah, no, it's that's what I said. It's a movement. So it's actually, and well, APRSEM at the regional level is just a platform, a space where we converge. But it's really about the people. So the examples I gave earlier, so community in Thailand, where they were able to action of the coal-fired power plant, is an example of how development justice is happening, because it's the community resisting and reclaiming their space and demanding justice. And then, yeah, the Mongolian case also, it's using the SDGs as a tool to really demand accountability from the government. So, for example, the VNR, the Voluntary National Review, it has been this challenge for most of the CSOs in the region that it's very difficult to engage at the national level because the VNR is not open or inclusive to CSOs. So there are many countries, for example, I can say in the Philippines, that the government, there are CSOs, but who are these CSOs? Are they really representing the communities? And it's like,
Are you still here, April? Hello, April. Seems to be a connection issue.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can now.
Wait, let me, sorry. Let me reconnect my.
Sure, no problem.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Or so where am I? Yeah, so the how do we use the SDGs as a tool? Because we're not saying that we will not engage. So we're saying that we should be demanding this space. We should be reclaiming this space so that we will be heard and that the government will see, or yeah, basically, doing this advocacy and campaign work on what's the issue, and then also demanding that we should be heard. We should. I remember the very popular, the Leave No One Behind, right? Nothing about us without us. So that's how we use the SDGs as a tool to demand accountability from our government.
How do grassroots and CSOs can further push for justice and gender equality? How do we make our voices heard?
Okay. Yes. So that's my example earlier too, no, for the VNR, the Voluntary National Review process, that in most countries in the region, governments are not inclusive. And I think that's the value of what we are doing at the regional. For example, at the Asia Pacific Forum on Sustainable Development, so governments, when they are, well, we know diplomacy in the UN, no, but we can actually maximize the space at the regional and global level to speak up and to have this dialogue with the government if they don't want to talk to us at the national level. So I can speak of the Philippine situation because also here it's very repressive. The government is choosing the CSO that they will be working on, and also progressive CSOs are being tagged as terrorists. So we cannot really engage at the national level. So what we do is we maximize the space at the regional and global level. So there is the 2030 agenda space, the APFSD, HLTF, but then there's also the UN human rights mechanisms, for example, that we also maximize. So it's tiring sometimes, but it's also a way for us to link with other solidarity groups that could actually support us, no, at the regional, international level, and make a noise in terms of the issues that we are experiencing at the national level. So yeah, that's what I can share on how it's difficult. I know, I understand, because we also have in the Philippines, we experience that as well, and in other countries in Southeast Asia, for example. But yeah, it's really solidarity building among us and maximizing the different space that we can reclaim at different levels.
Who's asking, are there any real life examples that showed CSOs and grassroots people can actually have a conversation with the government? Are there any successful examples of that in terms of gender equality?
Yeah, the example I gave earlier is the coal-fired power plant. It's my favorite because it's very concrete, no, that they are resisting the construction of the coal-fired power plant, and it's not just a simple resistance among the communities, no, but it's a lobbying work. It's an advocacy work. So they did lobbying at the local level with the local government. They did lobbying with the national government, and of course with the UN. That's why they have, APWLD was also able to support that, because we facilitated them at the regional level. So I think those dialogues, it led to the stoppage of the construction of the coal-fired power plant. In terms of gender, because we also see this as intersecting issues. So in that case, in the coal-fired power plant case, it's actually the women who are leading the campaign, which is very unique and very empowering also, because with that, with displacement, it's impacts women. Most vulnerable are women. So as I'm saying, in terms of food security, in terms of managing the household, etc., or health and well-being of the family, it's really a multiple burden for women if economically they are being challenged. So for example, in the case of displacement or if that coal-fired power plant will be built there, so it will really have a bigger impact on women. So yeah, at least that's how we see it. So how intersectionality and how these levels of advocacy work are able to support that kind of success stories at the local level.
I wonder how you view the tension between civil society and nation states in the process of achieving development justice.
Yeah. So what I have been explaining earlier, that in most countries, CSOs are not, the government is not open for CSO participation at the national level. So that's why most of us are at the regional and global level. And actually, there are member states that are more open. So we can see that, for example, the global north member states like Sweden, Norway, most of the Scandinavian, because they are also at the forefront of this, for example, gender equality. But we can find allies among them. That's also true. So when we are in the HLPF, for example, we talk to them on the sidelines bilaterally, and we explain that in our countries, we cannot do this, we cannot speak about this. Can you actually support us in the negotiations? So because the political declaration is really a negotiation of language between member states. So can you be the one to champion this phrase, for example, on gender rights? Or we haven't put development justice in the political declaration, but at least some bits of it on inclusive participation, for example, at the VNR or at the regional level. So those small wins that we actually try to do by working with allies. So it's also lobbying with more open member states that are more open to CSO.
Thank you very much to April again for joining our webinar today.